Hello, liebe Leute. It's Kristi here, and it is currently my lunch hour. And because I told you guys I would make a real effort to get through my History of Karen, or History of God by Karen Armstrong, sorry, you're conflating all those words together, A Different Atheist Read series, I wanted to finish that, and I have. The other thing that I wanted to finish up before I start getting into other things was to finish up my thesis. So this is an aid of that element. And then I will be having a very busy weekend. This coming weekend, I have a hangout scheduled where we're going to be looking at Sargon of Akkad on YouTube and whether or not he does engage in the kind of fallacies and other tactics that are commonly used in creationist videos or other ways that people want to. That's my take. I'm going to be inviting some people on, and we're all going to have our own individual takes. But I'm going to present evidence again and deal with that. Also looking to do a lot of catch up with American politics. A week is a lifetime in politics these days, especially with the primaries, and there's been so much happening in so many dimensions. It's a little bit hard for me to keep up since this isn't my full-time job. So I'm going to be joined by Will Fox, I believe, coming up on Saturday in the afternoon, and we're going to be doing a hangout talking about politics. And then Sunday is the Sherlock versus Sherlock hangout. So I've got a lot coming up in the next few days, but because I do want to get this done, we're going to continue plowing through. I would hope that in this section that we're going to finish up the remainder of chapter 5. And then all that's left is a conclusion. Again, if you would like to read chapter 6, you can go ahead and read it on your own, but it tests gender gap theories from the US, which really isn't as relevant to the empirical claims. I mean, I've already made the empirical claims and tested the theories and found the conclusions sufficient for the thesis in chapters 4 and 5. So we're only going to be looking at those. Therefore, getting on so that we can wrap this up, I'll continue on. And if you'll recall, in this chapter, we looked at attitudes rather than behaviors as ways to try to measure the impact or the explanatory power of understanding the man-woman variable as opposed to gendered measures that capture sort of gendered things in a society. So, from the thesis, partisanship. The next section will examine the socio-demographic model as applied to respondent propensity to partisanship generally and to respondent propensity to support one of the two major parties. As noted in the previous chapter, partisan identification is the measure of which and to what degree individuals identify themselves as supporters of or are as closer to a political party. The hypotheses for this section are similar to those generated to predict intention to vote and vote choice, but will be modified to predict likelihood of holding a partisan versus a non-partisan attitude, likelihood of labor partisanship, and likelihood of conservative partisanship. Because the concept of agency is associated with the drive to assert oneself and control one's environment, we can predict that individuals with a higher sense of their own agency may be more likely to feel efficacious and will therefore be more likely to identify with a political party. Hypothesis 8. Agency will produce a positive, statistically significant coefficient when included in a model of partisanship. Further, the measures of agency and communion should produce similar patterns to those in Chapter 4 with regard to conservative and labor partisan support. If right-leaning parties are associated with smaller government, more personal responsibility, and self-sufficiency, we would predict those with a high sense of their own agency would share these values. Alternatively, if a left-leaning party promotes wider social welfare, programs which are grounded in providing for the common good, for example, enacting legislation to reduce climate change, even if it is inconvenient, then individuals with a higher sense of communion, of being connected to others, and part of a wider social structure should share those views with the left-leaning party. From this, I have generated additional hypotheses which state: H9. Agency will have a negative and statistically significant relationship with labor partisanship. Hypothesis 10. Agency will have a positive and statistically significant relationship with conservative partisanship. Hypothesis 11. Communion will have a positive and statistically significant relationship with labor partisanship. Hypothesis 12. Communion will have a negative and statistically significant relationship with conservative partisanship. As part of the special project on measurement validity, another wording experiment was conducted in conjunction with Dr. Rob Johns at that time of Strathclyde University. He wanted to replicate a small-scale experiment he had conducted with university undergraduates, which suggested that there were sex differences in partisan responses depending upon the question wording. In our dataset, 2 questions on partisan identification were used, one near the beginning and the other near the end of the survey. 1. Some people think of themselves as being a supporter of one political party rather than another. Do you usually think of yourself as being a supporter of one particular party or not? 2. Some people feel themselves to be a supporter of one political party rather than another. Do you feel yourself to be a supporter of one particular party or not? Respondents could respond by answering yes, no, or I don't know. Informed by the exploratory results, Johns went on to replicate the questions with an internet survey conducted by YouGov between the 29th of May and the 2nd of June 2008, with a final N of 2,461 respondents. In a paper recently presented at the Elections, Public Opinion and Parties Conference, Johns et al. Presented the results of the analysis of the 2008 data. According to the authors, quote, "The results suggest a gender generation gap. Among younger respondents, we replicated Burden's finding that a feel prompt reduces women's identification with labor. Among older females, a feel prompt actually reduced women's support for the Conservatives." Unquote. For the analysis below, I use both the think and feel partisanship questions. I have recoded the responses such that yes equals 1 and no and I don't know equals 0, on the premise that if someone does not know whether or not they feel closer to a party, they are not partisans in the way the concept has been traditionally used in political science analysis. As the dependent variable is dichotomous, logistic regression will be used to analyze the socio-demographic model. To be consistent with previous logistic regression models presented in this thesis, the range of the pseudo-R-squares are reported from the Cox and Snell to the Nager-Kirkle, as are the logged odds and their standard errors, the odds ratios, and the statistical significance for each independent variable. Also, for consistency of interpretation with previous analyses, the reference group has been set as 0 for all of the dichotomous variables, and the effect of being a member of that reference group is displayed as having a positive or negative effect. Starting with Table 5.10, analysis on the think measure using the socio-demographic model 1 produces a low R-square ranging from 4 to 5%. Being older, beta equals 0.02, being self-identified Christian, beta equals 0.40, having a higher income, beta equals 0.06, and having a mortgage, beta equals 0.22, all increase the likelihood of partisanship. Women were less likely than men to indicate they thought of themselves as a member of a political party, beta equals negative 0.27. Inclusion of the gender measures does not change the pseudo-R-square by any large amount, 5 to 6%. In the Model 2 version of the socio-demographic model, agency is positive and statistically significant as predicted by H8. Further, inclusion of the gender variable reduces the negative effect of being female on partisanship slightly. So again, here's the table. I'll just take a little step out. And as you can see, again, with we've got highest statistical significance. It's a little bit difficult to do a comparison with a dichotomous dependent variable when you're comparing the effects of negative and positive coefficients. Right, let me start over again and see if I can help you guys out. So whenever we've been doing ordinary least squares regression up until this point, we've taken that standardized measure, the beta, and we have ignored the positive and negative signs, and we've put it in rank order to evaluate which variable in the model is providing a lot of is contributing to the explanation. Unfortunately, the same principle cannot be applied to logistic regression analysis, and that is because the range of probability that a number can have is not equal on both sides of the event. So there's a range, so you can see like the PB here goes from like 1.49, which means it increases it by a certain amount. I'm not going to do the odds ratios here, but you can't just take 0.77 and because it's all the negatives are going to be below 0. So anything that's positive in the XPB column here is going to be 1 point something because it's a positive number. It's increasing the likelihood. But when you get down to the negatives, you have to go from below 1 to 0. So all of the negative coefficients here are compressed within from going, let's say, 0.99 down to 0.01, whereas the positive values could go from 0.02 to 0.099 or 2 point something or 3 point something. So there's not, you just have to look whether or not, for these models, we're just looking at it if it increases it or if it decreases it, and if it increases the amount of difference or not. And that way, when you look at the female coefficient here, it's negative 0.27. And when we include agency reduces the effect a bit. And we see to female. And then agency comes in here and has a positive effect, and it's highly statistically significant. So really, we're looking for the purposes of here, we're looking to see what the sign of the coefficient is. And when we include new variables in the model, what happens to the impact of the sex variable when you add agency, communion, and emotional vulnerability. So sorry if that's I wish I could go into a longer explanation, but I would have to get out my logistic regression lecture notes, and we don't have time for those. So positive or negative, and what impact does model 2 have compared to model 1? That's what we're looking for. Right, now then, where did I leave off? Okay. In Model 2, the field measure analysis, the pattern is similar to that found above. So we have the think measure here, and here we're going to go and look at the field measure just to make sure that it's not an artifact of the question wording. That's why I run the test twice here. In Model 2 of the field measure analysis, the pattern is similar to that found above. Agency C is statistically significant and positive, support for hypothesis 8, and its inclusion reduces the explanatory power of the female variable. Inclusion of the gender variables has the effect of increasing the pseudo R-squared slightly, 3 to 6%. In addition, in comparing tables 5.10 and 5.11, the results of both models are very similar. This similarity suggests, drawing on the principle of convergent validity, that the two dependent variable measures I am employing are, in fact, measuring the same thing. To test the role of sex and gender measures in understanding partisanship, the next series of logistic regression analyses evaluate the role of sex and gender on labor and conservative partisanship. I have narrowed the analysis to compare those respondents who indicated they thought of themselves as being a member of a political party and excluded from the analysis all those respondents who indicated they didn't think of themselves as a member of a party or who indicated they didn't know. Table 5.12 notes the results of the analysis conducted on those who consider themselves labor partisans as compared with all other partisan respondents. First, and in line with the previous results, the socio-demographic model produces a low pseudo R-squared of between 6 and 8%. Adding the three measures of gender to Model 2 slightly increases the pseudo measures R-squared to between 7 and 10%, and all the variables from Model 1 remain stable. As predicted by Hypothesis 9, a high score on measures of agency is negatively associated with being a labor partisan. And as predicted by Hypothesis 11, having a high score on measures of communion is associated with an increase in likelihood of labor partisanship. In contrast to the findings on vote choice in the previous chapter, or previous findings, among the partisan respondents, a higher score on emotional vulnerability is positively associated with having a labor identification. The sex variable is insignificant in both models. So here is labor partisanship. So you can say no sex effect, but we do have the gender measures here performing in the theoretically predicted directions, and also this unique result for the emotional vulnerability measure, which is very rarely statistically significant. Otherwise, the coefficients in the model remain stable when we include the new variables for agency, communion, and emotional vulnerability. Analysis of conservative party identification, table 5.13 below, indicates that using Model 1, those who indicated though they think of themselves as a conservative partisan are more likely than other partisan respondents to have obtained higher education, less likely to be a parent, less likely to live in the North, more likely to be a self-identified religious Christian, more likely to have a higher income, and more likely to have a mortgage. Being a female does not have a statistically significant effect on conservative partisanship in Model 1. Inclusion of the gender variables has a number of effects on the analysis of conservative partisanship. First, it increases the pseudo R-square measures from 9 to 12% in Model 1 to 11 to 15% in Model 2. Including the gender measures renders the effect of education insignificant in Model 2 and makes the sex variable significant, with women more likely to indicate they are conservative partisans. The effects of the gender variables provide additional support for hypotheses 10 and 12, with agency having a statistically significant positive association and communion having a statistically significant negative association. So going back up here to the results, as you can see, if you were to just run this model without the measures of agency, communion, and emotional vulnerability, you would think that there are no sex differences between men and women in the conservative, in people who identify as conservative partisans. However, when you do control for that sense of agency and communion, what you find is that women who are identifying as partisans are women it's a better predictor of that. Now that might be part of the gender generation gap, it might be because of something else. But here we have the only instance I can think of, I'm pretty sure this is the only instance, but it is an instance in the data. We're adding where sex was not statistically significant. There might have been one other one in the previous chapter, so I may not remember this correctly, but we have the effect of actually making sex statistically significant, because once we've canceled out the variation created by communion and emotional vulnerability, we then have a unique set of variation that is associated with the biological variable rather than agency or communion. So in this case, the inclusion of these gendered measures improves our understanding of causality within our analysis. And this is an important reason why we need to properly operationalize concepts and include them in our models so that we don't mistake one source of variation for another. Conclusion. As with the previous chapter, a substantial amount of information and statistical analyses have been covered. It is therefore important to look at what this chapter has covered in totality in order to assess the performance of measures of gender within a socio-demographic model. For convenience, I restate all the hypotheses tested in this chapter below. So if you remember here, there's H6, 7, 8, 9. I read them out, so I'll leave them on the screen. You can go ahead and have a quick read if you would like to. The patterns of relationship between agency and communion and political preferences found in Chapter 4 are repeated in the ordinary least squares and logistic regression results presented above. In all but one of the analyses conducted, the empirical analysis showed the measure for agency was both statistically significant and in the predicted directions, the exception to this being in Table 5.7, the analysis of libertarian authoritarian views. The performance of communion was also robust. For the most part, the communion measure was not significant in the two analyses on partisanship using both the think and feel measures in Tables 5.12 and 13. Overall, there is evidence to partially support hypotheses 6 and 7. The results of the statistical analysis of partisanship provides evidence in support of hypothesis 8, and the analysis of partisanship provides evidence in support of hypotheses 9 through 12. One other finding is worth noting. When analyzing only the partisan respondents, higher scores on the measures of emotional vulnerability was associated with labor partisan identifiers, not conservative identifiers. As noted in Chapter 4, the EMV measures were consistently associated with conservative vote choice, and this finding provides a contradictory result. Does the difference lie in the fact that partisans and voters are different types of people? Is this simply an artifact of this particular internet dataset? Future analyses will include running models on voters versus non-voters to further explore these questions. What is the overall story we can derive from these results? And the results not only of this chapter, but of the results of chapters 4 and 5 when examined in combination. The first conclusion that can be reached is that these findings suggest that measures of sex and gender may offer separate pieces of explanatory information when accounting for people's political attitudes. The results of this chapter strengthen the argument against the idea that social sciences can use biological measures of sex as a proxy for gender. A second conclusion that can be reached based upon the results above is that a high sense of one's own agency is associated with right-leaning political attitudes, partisanship, and voting propensity, whereas a high sense of communion is associated with left-leaning political attitudes. Using these exploratory results, I propose a different answer to the question first investigated by Pippa Norris. Whilst Norris found no evidence for the existence of an ideological gender gap, my claim is that my analysis has shown that such a gap does exist. There is a gender gap when measures of gender are included in the analysis, but there is still not an ideological sex gap in British men and women's political ideologies. These results represent the first occasion in British political science where such ideological gender differences have been found. This, I feel, is an important finding for British political science. These results may provide a framework for better understanding how individuals form their political preferences, as well as providing better explanations. Providing better explanations as to why individuals hold certain political attitudes. There's nothing like reading something out loud to find typos. It's the absolute best way. And I've learned that subsequent to submitting my thesis to the library at Essex. But since then, and also it's a long, as you can see, it's long to read out loud. But if you ever have to do any copy editing of your own work, I would strongly recommend that you read it out loud as a way to copy edit it, because you will catch every mistake if you have to read it out, as I have when I've been reading this out. All right, then the only thing we have left is then the conclusion. And because I have a lot going on the Saturday in terms of putting out content, I've got 3 hangouts now scheduled for this weekend, which is insane, but we're going to get through it because life is short and we need to make use of all the time we have. The conclusion chapter for this thesis will be coming out right now. I'm going to predict on the Monday. I think what I'll do is record it and set it to scheduled or private and then release it on Monday. That way I won't have just tons and tons of comment clogging up your subscription feed if you subscribe to my channel. That is it, really. We have now almost made it to the very end, and congratulations to you for sticking out all this nerdy content. I appreciate your time and attention, and I'm sure if you guys are around this weekend and check out my channel, I will probably be on or have recently been on or will be coming on soon. So until the next time, guys, I've been Kristi. You've been awesome. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you later. Bye.